So here we go with looking at part one of the causes of the Chinese Civil War. But before we start looking at these, first a little bit of background about the Chinese Civil War. As you already know, I'm sure, the Chinese Civil War was fought between the communists, led by the Chinese Communist Party, and the nationalists, led by the Kuomintang. And so it began in 1927 and was fought for a decade. There was a pause in 1937 when Japan invaded China in the Second Indochina War. This is also the beginning of World War II in Asia, 1937. And at that time, the communists and the nationalists called a ceasefire on the Civil War in order to deal with the larger problem of Japan and World War II. And the Civil War resumes in 1946 until at the end of World War II and is concluded in 1949. So, in looking at the long-term causes, it's really important that by the time you finish watching this series of videos, you understand the long-term social, political, and economic causes of the Chinese Civil War. So one of the things you probably want to do is go back and pause and go back and look at the video that talks about the wars in general and review some of the important ideas, concepts before we move on. But knowing you as I do, you probably didn't pause and do this, but try to by the time you finish watching. The other thing is, since we're looking at the Chinese Civil War and we spent a lot of time talking about other things that were happening globally, it's important for you to take some time to connect with what is happening in other parts of the world that then therefore has an influence on the domestic situation in China, and that will then influence the outbreak of war. And then, since this is your second Civil War, and they also love to ask you questions about comparing and contrasting because this is history and this is what we do, hopefully you learn and you will compare and contrast one of the most important long-term causes of the Chinese Civil War is this Manchu Dynasty, the Qing Dynasty. The Qing Dynasty began rule in China in the mid-17th century. And they were ethnically Manchu, that is coming from the Manchu portion of China in the northeast. And as time goes on, and by the time we get to the 1800s, and as there are increasing problems with the economy, increasing problems with imperialism, increasing erosion of the quality of people's lives, they are blaming the rulers for being unable to adequately deal with these issues. And one of the things that they seized upon as being a really important symbol as to why they are unable to deal with this is that they are ethnically Manchu, whereas the vast majority of Chinese are ethnically Han. And so, as Manchu, they are perceived as being foreign, and that foreignness is closely connected to the corruption of the state apparatus, and they are illegitimate rulers. So that lack of legitimacy, that is the basis of it, is the perception of their foreignness, means that they have increasingly greater difficulty in controlling the country. And so here we have the Dowager Empress Cixi, and she ruled from 1861 to 1908. So basically, she was the power behind the throne during this time of increasing civil unrest, increasing economic, political problems. Now, I say that she ruled because she was the power behind the throne. She ruled through her children, her grandchildren. And historically, there has been a lot of emphasis placed on her poor rule as reasons for the revolutions, essentially. And part of that comes from the fact that she was quite resistant to change. She had limited understanding of what was happening politically. And so China fell further and further behind in terms of modernity, development economically, militarily than the West. And however, more recently, a historian called Yung Chang has disputed these interpretations of the Dowager Empress Cixi. Yung Chang, the historian, says that a really big portion of this negative interpretation of Cixi has been two things. One, historically, as a woman in a very male-dominated society, that things fell apart in her rule is going to be blamed on her because, she's a woman. The other thing, of course, is that a lot of the history and the interpretation of Cixi and kind of the gatekeeper of the records and information has been through the Chinese Communist Party, which of course is going to have a negative interpretation of the imperial system that they are completely opposed to. So it depends on how you look at it. There's the traditional interpretation, and then there's Yung Chang's post-revisionist interpretation of the Empress. So in Yung Chang's post-revisionist interpretation, the vast majority of, or a significant portion of, the following items discussed about the end years of the Manchu Dynasty are contradicted. So let's start with our comparisons, right? So both in Spain and China had imperial stroke ruling families. And so how could you compare the Qing dynasty with the Bourbon dynasty of Spain before the Civil War? Similarities, differences, impacts. As always with civil wars, it wouldn't be a civil war unless you had internal unrest, right? Because of course, civil wars are happening between different segments of society within the country. And so we have massive amounts of civil unrest. And some of these, in the terms of China, go back a very long time. And what they all do, though, is show that the ruling dynasty is unable to adequately deal with them. And they show this sort of like perpetual unrest and movement attempt to change the system. And they just work, thirdly, because I'm really good at the counting thing. They just work to continually and further destabilize the social society. And with that destabilization comes other impacts. So one of the underlying causes for this internal unrest is the decline of the imperial army. There was a lack of modernization, and they became increasingly unable to compete on an international stage and domestically. So on an international stage, one of the things that is happening, of course, is we have the expansion of Japan. We also have the European imperialists coming to China. We have the expansion of Russia, etc. And then domestically, we have unrest that the army is unable to quell. And so that means that now we have the development of regional armies. So increasingly, as the Manchurian army, and not Manchurian from Manchu, but the Qing army deteriorates in quality, it is unable to keep control over lands that were historically ruled by China. And so what you start having are more local leaders who are able to raise their own armies and their own regional armies and kind of hold the control of the central government at bay. And that, of course, is going to disrupt financial matters for the central government and make it increasingly it increasingly destabilizes the society. One of the first things that happens is called the Taiping Rebellion, which happens from 1850 to 1864. I told you we were going back a long way. And you can also consider this a civil war. Essentially, what happened is it happened in southern China, and there was a rebellion against the central government, and they established something called the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, and the capital is in Nanjing. And while the government attempted to quell this, as you can see, it lasted 14 years. You see, my math, it's good this time. And you can see there that they are unable to actually control the entire country. And the army has deteriorated to such a point that the Qing needs to ask for the help of France and Britain to subdue it. And in doing so, they actually give up some of their sovereignty to France and Britain. France and Britain are not gonna, get involved in this civil war out of the kindness of their hearts. But they're going to get additional concessions, that is, treaties that favor France and Britain, and in essence, place France and Britain somewhat outside the laws of the Qing. So we have here a loss of sovereignty, an autonomy to outside powers. So an encroachment of the imperialism. And it ranges from 20 million to 70 million dead. They don't quite know how many, but it is categorized as one of the bloodiest and deadliest civil wars in history. And this Taiping Rebellion was one of the it was the bloodiest and the biggest conflict that China had faced since the Qing had actually ascended to power and fought to bring China under their control. So although it happened a long time before the Civil War, the Taiping Rebellion has long-lasting repercussions. And here we have a handy-dandy map of China. Hope you got that part. And so basically looking at the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. And so if you look near the bottom, you can see the lined area of where the Taiping Rebellion began. And then all of the pink areas, the area that they controlled, what was the Heavenly Kingdom. And then in red, you see Nanking, the established capital of the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom. The other thing that I would like to bring your attention to is if you look at the map, there is a black line that goes all around, and that is the border of China. Now, if you also see, sometimes on that black line, but inwardly is a dotted line of, by the time we get to 1954, the lands that are actually controlled by China. And this indicates essentially the contraction of the Qing Empire as the army lost control of the more frontier areas. Further unrest comes in the form of the Boxer Rebellion, which happens in 1898 to 1900. And the Boxer Rebellion is a proto-nationalist movement. And we talk about proto because this is one of the first times you see this sort of coalescing and development of a Chinese consciousness. And it's nationalist because the point is to focus on saving China from the imperialism of the Europeans. And in the case of imperialism, governments tended to work in a number of different ways. One of the first steps, now this wasn't government sanctioned. It wasn't necessarily that the government sent people out to do this. But Christianity is a religion that focuses on proselytizing, that is expanding and telling people, converting people. Now in Europe, people saw this in a couple of different ways. Part of it was a religious way, as in they truly believed in their religion and they sent people out to share this and add converts. Another thing, of course, is not only do they believe in the religious message, but they also believe in the civilizing aspect of their religion. So millions, okay, maybe not millions, but many, you know me in numbers, missionaries left Europe to go to the Americas, Africa, and Asia to work on their civilizing and Christianizing message. And this missionary work functioned as a way of soft intrusion into an area. What it helped do is make people more open to Western ideas, make them more accepting of the European countries, and kind of open the door some for the countries and companies to enter the country. And the Boxer Rebellion is also going to serve as the second important aspect that the missionaries served to the government. And this one is really, really cynical. So as the Boxer Rebellion began, and the reason why it's called the Boxer Rebellion is it began amongst a martial group that were practicing a martial art, hence boxer, and this had a real spiritual aspect to it as well. And so it was nationalist and spiritualist, and so they went opposing the foreign religion. And they rose up and they killed a lot of the European missionaries, and they also killed a lot of the Chinese Christians, essentially because they were no longer Chinese, hence the nationalist aspect of it. Now, the Empress Cixi officially did not support the Boxers, but she hoped that this would be a way of getting rid of the thorn in her side, namely the Europeans. And so she gave unofficial support. Now, these guys are fighting with really rudimentary weapons and essentially their belief. They thought their spiritual belief would make them invulnerable to bullets, and they would be able to overcome. Now, of course, that didn't happen, or else we wouldn't be talking about the Chinese Civil War and how this was a long-term cause. The result is going to be the Boxer Protocol of 1901. Because this was a Chinese uprising against the Europeans, and because the Europeans won, they were able to force the Chinese government into massive concessions. Which brings me to the second way that the missionaries were used by their home governments. Essentially, once missionaries were killed, they used this as an excuse to now further intrude on the country, to plant armies where they didn't have before, and to be able to, because they have to protect their people, and be able to gain even more control over the government. And so the Boxer Protocol resulted in a $300 million fine, greater concessions for the Europeans. And what the Qing government does is passes this $300 million fine onto the populace by increasing taxes. These are largely subsistence farmers, and this is incredibly painful. And so this additional cost that they have to pay is going to make it even more difficult for them and increased the illegitimacy of the Qing government. Now, additionally, there are Muslim rebellions throughout the country. China has a large Muslim population as a result of the Mongol dynasty and the expansion of the Islamic empires in the previous centuries. And so these are resulting from, not only are they religiously different from the rest, from the Qing, but they are also ethnically different. They are not Han, they are not Manchu. And so because of discrimination from the government and lack of respect for their ways, they saw the opportunity, and it happened slowly, of course, but they rebelled against the government and attempting to force concessions themselves or secede. You also have a rebellion by the Hua in the north, another ethnic group, and this is going to begin from famine. And so you see that there are religious issues, there's poverty, problems with food, and then of course this developing nationalism.